right, Miguel Najdorf. He was born Moshe Najdorf, Moshe Mendel Najdorf, born in Poland, Warsaw, a pupil of Savieli Tartakover. By the way, he was born April 15th, 1910. He passed away July 4th, 1997. When he was 20 years old, he became a Polish national master, and he played in the Olympiads for Poland in 1935, 37, and 39. And it was in 1939 that World War II broke out in his country while he was in the Olympiad at Buenos Aires. And so he decided not to attempt to return home. He, in 1944, adopted Argentine citizenship, also adopting and changing his name to Miguel. But all of his family were murdered in German concentration camps. In 1950, he was one of the 27 inaugural recipients of the Grandmaster title. In 1943, he set a world record for simultaneous games played, playing 202 people at the same time. Out of those 202 simultaneous games, he won 182. He lost 8. He drew 12. If you think that's impressive, he also set a record, at least a record when he played it, of 45 simultaneous games blindfolded. 45 games at a time without ever looking at the board. Winning 39, losing 2, drawing 4. In the late 1930s and the 1940s, he clearly established himself as one of the world's best players. He won at Budapest 1936. He won at Buenos Aires 1939. Buenos Aires Circulo 1941. Mar del Plata he won in 42, 43, 44, 46, and 47. Full 3-point lead over second place in 1946. He won in Rio de Janeiro in 1946. He won in Venice in 1948. He won at Prague in 1946. Forgot to mention Prague. And Sharkton 1194 already mentioned Najdorf's contribution to the opening, not just Najdorf's variation of the Sicilian, although that was and is one of the most popular lines of all time. It was definitely Bobby Fischer's favorite. Anyway, one thing about Miguel Najdorf that a lot of people don't know is that after Alexander Alekhine died in 1948, they had a 5-player quad round robin or something like this for the replacement for the World Championship. In that year, 1948, Miguel Najdorf was ranked second in the world behind Botvinnik, and yet he did not receive an invitation to play in the World Championship. The only player ranked higher was the guy who ended up winning it, but it just goes to show you, the very first World Championship that was under FIDE's control, as soon as they got their hands on it, they ruined it and corrupted it with politics, and that's been their way ever since. Anyway, we start with Retti's opening. Knight f6, symmetrical defense. So c4 transposes to the Anglo-Indian. g6, g3, we're going to have a King's Fianchetto variation. Bishop g7, an Anglo-King's Indian. Bishop g2. Castles, now d4, and that turns it into a standard King's Indian defense with d6. Castles is Oscar Pano's system. Knight c6, knight c3, pawn e5, pawn d5. This is the Ullmann-Szabo system, named for Wolfgang Ullmann and Laszlo Szabo. Ullmann, a German, Szabo, a Hungarian, if I'm not mistaken. Well, both have been played at various points. c5 is usually answered by knight c3, and then knight c6, and then d5 hits the knight. Knight a5 hits this pawn. Knight d2 defends that pawn. And then we play a6, queen c2, rook b8, and you're going to attack up on this line like so. b3, b5, bishop b2, takes, and bishop h6 here, an unusual looking move, but then it gets blocked off by f4. And then finally e5 is played anyway. D takes and knight g4. That's threatening to fork the rook and the queen. So anyway, that's the c5 line. I prefer the c5 line because if I'm going to fan kettle my bishop, I don't want this diagonal closed off. In this game, however, knight c6, knight c3, and the e5 line, which brings us to the Ullmann-Szabo system. Pawn d5, hitting the knight. Knight e7, pawn e4, knight d7, pawn b4 leaves the book. The book move is knight e1, getting out of the way of the pawn. But before he can push his pawn, I'm going to push my pawn with f5. And after knight d3, repositioning his knight, we're going to play our knight back to f6. We only moved it to get out of the way of the pawn. Now bishop g5 adds some pressure, and we are out of the book, but the most common response is to put the question to that bishop, and typically the bishop will trade itself off for the knight, and then bishop takes bishop. Then we get this pawn pushing forward, like so. And usually bishop e5 is played. Okay, coming back. In this game, b4 right here. Bobby with f5, the bot calling for a5 to maintain an equal position. a5, I'm not real familiar with this line, but if I'm not mistaken, bishop a3, I guess you could take the pawn. I think probably both are probably played, but I think bishop a3 is the more common, right? You probably can take the pawn, and then the rook will take. And I'm guessing a4, right? Anyway, b4 in this game, f5. Oh, yeah, I was showing the alternate to this line. Knight g5 here, threatening knight e6, which is a forkosaurus. So knight f6 defends that square. Bishop a3 in this position. So just to comment, knight e6 now is ugly. In fact, it gets a question mark, then it's changed to inaccurate. But the point is, after takes, this pawn won't be hard to pick up. So bishop a3, f takes e4, queen's knight takes e4, knight f5, bishop b2, knight takes the knight, knight takes the knight, knight d4, pawn f4. This pawn is overworked. Right now, we need both of these defenders on our knight because our opponent has two attackers. Bishop here to f5 is played. Queen d2, pawn c5. The bot calling for queen e7. I had the same idea, but instead of queen e7, I had the idea of queen d7. And the idea of both of these moves, and I get a star, the idea of both of these moves is to threaten queen a4. But the reason I like the d7 is to get off the back rank. c5 was played, and Najdorf captures en passant. The bot calling for a pawn capture, or b takes, I should say. The pawn calling for b takes. What happens at queen a4, right? So, for example, let's say rook a d1, queen a4. You've got a point of infiltration, right? That's the idea of queen e8, is queen a4. And there are a lot of soft pieces up here. Anyway, d takes c6, en passant. Pawn takes the pawn on c6. King h1 is a very thematic move. We've talked about this many times before. Get the king off of the open line. Queen d7, queen's rook to e1, queen's rook to d8. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Pretty equal position, isn't it? c5, queen e6, knight d6. That discovers a pin on this pawn, which means the knight is en prise, and bishop takes knight would be a winning move. So Bobby runs away. Well, it's saying queen takes a2. I didn't think that would be as strong myself. I did not think that would be as strong after rook a1, queen b3, bishop takes the knight. Don't take this pawn here. That would be wrong because, do you see it? Bishop h3. Double exclam number 3 of the day. Number 3 of the day. How do you like those apples? And the point is, you can't take this because of queen d5. The bishop no longer being there is just lost. And now you can't just interpose again because that just loses immediately. That's a self-mate, right? If you interpose saying, you idiot, you not only gave up your bishop, but now I'm going to attack your queen. Well, guess what? You've moved into a pin. And so that's checkmate. You can't take because you're pinned. So for that reason, you'd have to come over here. Well, guess what? Look at that piece relationship. And bye-bye queenie anyway. One way or another, I'm getting that queen. So for that reason, do not play rook takes a7. Instead, bishop takes d4. And after pawn takes bishop, don't play that here either, right? Because bishop just drops back to e6. The bot says d7. Anyway, instead, knight takes bishop in this line. And after rook takes the knight, rook takes the rook. Another free-looking pawn is this one, but don't take that one either. Don't take here, and then I have rook takes rook. And after rook takes rook, I'm pushing my pawn. So a lot of free stuff that isn't free. It's all poisonous. So you'd have to play rook takes rook here. And after pawn takes rook, now you can play bishop takes this pawn. All right, let's go back. A lot of sidelines there. I didn't think, though, that that was as strong, but apparently it's just as good. But knight b5 is what was played. Here, queen e3, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn, bishop takes the pawn on e5, bishop takes the bishop, queen takes the bishop, queen takes the queen, and rook takes the queen. Bishop e6 here, rook takes the rook check, king takes the rook, and we have bishop rook versus bishop rook. Bishop f3, keeping our rook off of d1. Bishop takes the a-man, rook a5 forks, bishop d5, bishop takes the bishop, pawn takes the bishop. Slick little move to advance the pawn in front of his rooks, and rooks belong behind passed pawns. Oh yeah. Rook takes the a-man, d4, king g2, stay in the square of the pawn. d3, rook a1 has to blockade. No, there wouldn't be any point in pushing the h-man. You want to push your passed pawns. Here they agreed to a draw. In fact, you can't push the h-man here because black is busy pushing his own pawn. Okay. No, I don't see any scenario where pushing the h-man works, to be honest. Come back. If you're going to push a pawn, you want to push your passed pawn. That gets a star. That gets a star. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. It wouldn't do you any good to push this guy. All right, king g2, though, was played d3, and he realizes he's going to have to blockade, and the players agree to a draw. 96.3 for Najdorf. 96.7 for Fischer in terms of accuracy. Both players scoring 2,800 rating assessments. Very competitive game. Very precise on both sides.